Use code 8thPlaceDave to save 5% on your order at Face to Face Games, Canada's largest Magic the Gathering store, where qualified orders receive free shipping Canada-wide. Support the channel and visit facetofacegames.com today. In this video, I'm going to be going over the basic rules of how to play a game of Magic the Gathering. Now, this video will by no means cover all of the rules of Magic the Gathering, but after you finish watching, you should have the basic knowledge required in order to start playing your first game of Magic. So first off, what is Magic the Gathering? It's a trading card game where you take the role of a wizard and you cast spells in order to try and defeat one or more opposing players. In order to cast these spells, you require a resource known as mana, which you can use to pay for each spell's mana cost. There exist 5 different colors of mana, which you can see represented on the back of every Magic card. There are white, blue, black, red, and green. Now let's take a look at some of the information you can find on a Magic card. In the top left corner here, you can see the card's name. This is Elite Vanguard. In the top right corner, this is where you find the card's mana cost. The mana cost is depicted by a combination of either mana symbols, such as this white mana symbol, by numbers, such as this number 2, or by a combination of both, as you can see here. In the case of this Elite Vanguard, the cost of this card is 1 white mana. Directly underneath the art on the card, you can see the card's type. This is a creature, specifically a human soldier. Over to the right of the card type, here, you can see a symbol which shows both the expansion set that the card is from, as well as the rarity of the card. This card in particular is an uncommon because it has a silver symbol. A common would have either a white or a black symbol, like one of these cards. A rare would have a gold symbol, and a mythic rare would have a red symbol. This box below, right here, is where the text for the card's ability would be if it has an ability. This card in specific does not have an ability, but it still has some text here. This text is known as flavor text, and it just tells a little bit of story that you can read if you'd like. These numbers to the lower right corner here are this creature's power and then toughness, so it has 2 power and 1 toughness. And then to the lower left corner, you can find the name of the artist who made the art for this card. So this card that we're looking at here is a creature, but there are other types of cards as well, such as sorceries, artifacts, enchantments, instants, and these cards here, known as lands. These lands are the cards that will provide you with the mana that you need to cast your spells. Each different type of land can provide you with a color of mana corresponding to the symbol shown here. So this plains can give you white mana, island will give you blue, swamp will give you black, mountain will give you red, and forest will give you green. There are many different formats in which you can play Magic the Gathering, but for the sake of this video, we'll be referencing the rules of a format in which we start with 20 life, and we'll be showing it with this 20-sided die. Players often use a 20-sided die like this to represent their life total, or they might write it down on a piece of paper, or maybe even use an app on their phone to track their life total. There are 2 ways to win a game of Magic. One is to reduce your opponent's life total to 0. The second is to make your opponent run out of cards in their library. Library is a term which just means their deck of cards. If at any point in the game a player must draw a card and they have 0 cards left in their library, that player loses the game. The vast majority of the time, though, games are decided by having an opponent's life go to 0. There are many different ways to reduce an opponent's life total, but the most common way that you'll find is by attacking an opponent with your creature. We'll use this other 20-sided die to represent the opponent's life total. At the start of the game, each player shuffles their deck of cards and then draws an opening hand of 7 cards. The game is played with each player's hand being concealed to their opponent, so typically you won't know what's in your opponent's hand. After you've drawn your opening hand, you then have the option to do what's known as a mulligan. That would be if you decide that you don't want to play with your opening hand, you have the option to shuffle it back into your library, then draw 7 new cards, and for each time you've mulliganed, you then take 1 card from your hand and put it on the bottom of your library. You can do this multiple times, and there is strategy to it, but for the sake of this video, we're going to keep this opening hand that we have. At the start of each player's turn, that player will draw a card. However, at the beginning of the game, the player who takes the first turn skips their draw step. So let's say that I'm playing first. I've drawn my opening hand. I decide that I'm not going to mulligan. The opponent has also drawn their opening hand and decide they're not going to mulligan. Since I'm going first, I'm going to skip my draw step. So now we go to the main phase of my turn. There are several phases in each turn, and there are phases within those phases. Right now we're going to keep it simple though and say that there is the beginning phase, in which we would draw a card, the first main phase, the combat phase, the second main phase, and the end phase. During my main phase, I have the option to play lands or spells. During each of your turns, you're allowed to play one land. So I'm going to play my one land for this turn, which will be a forest. Typically, you'll see lands played closer to you in a row alongside your library, and then spells like creatures and artifacts and things like that in a row above your lands. Now that I have this forest in play, I have access to 1 green mana. The way I can get that mana is through tapping my forest. Tapping means turning a card sideways, like this. Now I have tapped this forest, and I have access to 1 green mana. I must spend this mana though before I move to the next phase of the turn, otherwise the mana is gone. So if I look at my hand, I have something that costs 2, 1 and a green makes 2, something that costs 2 also, another thing that costs 2, and something that costs 6. So this number 4 means that I can spend 4 mana of any color to pay this cost. However, I must also spend 2 mana, which is green. So 4 plus 2 green would be 6 mana in total. And I also have some more forests. So since I only have access to 1 mana, I can't actually play anything yet, so there isn't really any reason for me to tap this land at the moment. Next we would go to the combat phase, but there are no creatures in play, so no combat will take place. There will be a second main phase, where I have the option once again to play lands or spells. However, I've already played a land, so I can't do that. And then we go to the end phase, which means my turn is over, and then it goes to the opponent's turn. So the opponent would draw a card and put it into their hand. They then move to their first main phase, and they're going to play a land, much like I did. However, they're going to play this swamp, which will provide black mana. Much like me though, the opponent doesn't have enough mana to actually play a spell yet. So they're going to go to the combat phase, nothing happens. The second main phase, nothing happens. And then their turn is over, and it comes back to my turn. So at the beginning of my turn, I'm going to draw a card. And if you're a little bit familiar with Magic, you might be wondering why I missed something at the beginning of my turn, known as the untap step, but currently I don't have anything to untap, so we will get to that in just a moment. Now in my first main phase, I'm going to play another land. I now have 2 forests, so I have access to 2 green mana. Now I can actually play something. So I would like to cast this creature spell, which is known as Terrain Elemental. You can see it's a creature, an elemental to be specific. It costs 1 mana of any color. We usually say 1 generic mana and 1 green, so 2 total. It has 3 power and 2 toughness. So I'm going to tap these 2 forests, which provides me with 2 green mana, and I'm going to spend that to play this Terrain Elemental. This now enters the battlefield. The battlefield is basically a word to explain all of what you see here. This is the battlefield. Now that I have a creature in play, I'll soon be able to start attacking my opponent. However, creatures are subject to something known as summoning sickness. What that means is that a creature cannot attack or tap the turn in which it's played. You have to wait until the next turn comes around, and then you can attack. So since I've spent all my mana and already played a land, there's nothing else I can do, and it goes to the opponent's turn. The opponent will draw a card. In their main phase, they're going to play another swamp, and then they're going to tap these 2 swamps to get 2 black mana, and spend that black mana to play this Tattered Mummy. You can see it costs 1 and a black, so a total of 2. It's a creature, zombie jackal. This creature actually has an ability now. You can see it says, when Tattered Mummy dies, each opponent loses 2 life. It also has 1 power and 2 toughness. So now this creature is in play. The opponent will then pass the turn back to me, and now we'll get to what I was mentioning earlier. So at the beginning of your turn, it doesn't actually start with you drawing a card. The first thing that happens at the start of your turn is all of your permanents untap. Now that word I used, permanents, I'll tell you the meaning of that. A permanent is basically any card which remains on the battlefield. So all these lands and all these creatures, these are permanents. There are other spells that you can cast though which are not permanents, and that means once the spell has resolved and its effect has happened, it's going to go to the graveyard. The graveyard is just a term for the discard pile. So now that my lands have untapped, that means that I'll have the opportunity to tap them again to get some mana again. Next, I'm going to draw a card. There is actually a step in between the untap step and the draw step, known as the upkeep, in which players could potentially play spells or use abilities, but for the sake of this video, we're just going to say that nothing is happening during the upkeep, so we're just going to draw our card in our draw step. So now in my main phase, I'm going to play yet another forest, so now I have access to 3 green mana. If I would like, I could spend it on one of these cards that costs 2 here, but I'm not going to do that just quite yet. Next, I'm going to go to the combat phase. So now my creature can actually attack because it no longer has summoning sickness. So if I would like to attack my opponent, I do so by declaring which creatures are attacking, and I can show that by turning the creature sideways, meaning it's tapped, and now this creature is attacking my opponent. Whenever a creature is tapped, like mine is here, it cannot block. The opponent then has the opportunity to declare whether they would like to block or not, and how they would like to block. So let's say the opponent decides they would like to block my creature with their Tattered Mummy. They declare this as their blocker, and that now means that this attack has been blocked. Now, regardless of how much damage each of these creatures does to each other, the opponent is not going to take any damage because the attack has been blocked. We're now going to go to the damage step. So that means each of these creatures is going to deal damage equal to their power to the opposing creature. So Tattered Mummy is going to do 1 damage to Terrain Elemental because it has 1 power. So now Terrain Elemental has 2 toughness with 1 damage marked on it. Terrain Elemental is going to do 3 damage to Tattered Mummy because it has 3 power. Tattered Mummy only has 2 toughness though, so that means that this 3 damage is going to be enough damage to make this Tattered Mummy die. So it's going to go to the graveyard, usually put either above the library or beside it. However, remember this Tattered Mummy has an effect. It says, when Tattered Mummy dies, each opponent loses 2 life. So that means when this dies, I'm going to lose 2 life. And now that's the end of combat. It goes to main phase 2, where I can once again play lands and spells. I've already played a land, and I'd like to use this opportunity to play another spell. I'm going to spend 2 mana, so I'll need to tap these 2 lands to get 2 green mana. I'm going to play this enchantment spell, Quest for the Gemblades. It's an enchantment. It says here it costs 2 mana, 1 and a green. It says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a creature, you may put a quest counter on Quest for the Gemblades. Also, I can remove a quest counter from Quest for the Gemblades and sacrifice it, and then put 4 +1/+1 counters on target creature. So there are a few terms here I can explain. The first one being a counter. There are 2 types of counters on this card actually. One is a quest counter, and one is a +1/+1 counter. There are many different names for counters, such as a quest counter. That's just the name of the specific counter that will go on this card. +1/+1 counters though, those go on creatures typically, and what that means is if a creature has a +1/+1 counter on it, it then permanently has +1 power and +1 toughness as long as that counter remains on the card. And counters remain on cards until some kind of effect removes that counter, or until the card would move to a different zone, so say going from the battlefield to the graveyard, or maybe from the battlefield back to your hand, or something like that. The next term on this card you might be wondering about is Sacrifice. Basically what that means is you move it from the battlefield to the graveyard. And then there's this other term here, Target Creature. What that means is I have to choose a creature in which this ability will target. So Target Creature here is just referring to the creature which I choose as a target for this ability. So I'm going to spend my green mana and put this enchantment into play. For these counters that this card mentions, frequently what you'll see players do is use a die to represent the number of counters on a creature or enchantment or anything for that matter. So say I were to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, I would just do something like this to represent that it has that counter on it. You can use pretty much anything though. Even in some Magic products, they include little cardboard punch-out things that you can use as counters now too. And as I was reading this card, you might have noticed something weird about the time that I played it, because I played this in my second main phase after I had already attacked. And this card says, when a creature I control deals combat damage to a creature, I can put a counter on this. So that means that if I had played this in my first main phase, it probably would have been strategically beneficial to do it that way rather than wait until my second main phase. So that kind of brings a bit of strategy into the game, because you have to make the decision about when to play cards like this. Sometimes it's better to do it in your first main phase, sometimes it's better to do it in the second, or maybe in a different phase for that matter. So that's about all that I can do for this turn, so that means that I would end the turn and then it would go to the opponent's turn. So at this point you've seen most of the interactions that you actually need to know in order to play a game of Magic, but we'll go through one more turn cycle, and there's just a couple more types of cards that I'd like to show you before we end this video. So at the beginning of the opponent's turn, they would untap all of their permanents and then draw a card. The opponent will play their land for their turn. And let's say that this time the opponent decides to just do nothing and say that it's my turn. At this point, I might be feeling a little bit suspicious, because the opponent has cards in their hand and they have mana that they can use, but they didn't do anything with it. So we're going to see why that is in just a moment. So at the beginning of my turn, all of my permanents will untap, and then I'll draw a card and add this to my hand. In my first main phase, I'm going to play a forest. And then we're going to move to the combat phase. So I'm going to declare my attackers. I'm going to declare this creature as an attacker, and I'll tap it like this to show that it's attacking. My opponent would then get to declare their blockers, however they have no creatures with which to block, so they cannot block. I would then ask the opponent if we can proceed to the damage step, and if they agree, they would take 3 damage from this terrain elemental. However, the opponent's going to do something here. Even though it's my turn right now, there are some cards which can be cast on an opponent's turn. So the opponent here is going to tap 2 mana and then cast this Vicious Offering targeting my terrain elemental. So let's take a look at this. Vicious Offering is an instant. So this is one of the other card types I mentioned earlier. This is one of the card types which is not a permanent. So that means that once its effect happens, this card is going to go to the graveyard. This card has a couple of abilities here. The first one you see is Kicker, and it says sacrifice a creature. With a lot of abilities, you'll see that there's just a word here. In this case, it's Kicker, or you might see something like flying or trample or haste. On some cards, you'll see in these parentheses here, it explains what this ability does, but you won't always see this explanation. On some cards, it just has this word, and you're kind of just expected to know what it does. This is called reminder text. Typically, you'll see reminder text when there's an ability that's newly introduced into the game, or that's maybe brought back from a previous set that hasn't been around for a while. But if you see a word like this and you don't know what it means, and there's also no reminder text, you can just go online and look up what exactly this ability does. In this case, it says, you may sacrifice a creature in addition to any other costs as you cast this spell. Let's read what the rest of the card says. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn instead. So basically, if the opponent had sacrificed a creature to this kicker cost, then this card would get kind of a boost in its effect. However, they didn't have any creatures with which to sacrifice, so that means this card is going to give my creature -2 power and -2 toughness until end of turn. So this is currently what's called on the stack. What that means is my opponent has played this card, but before the effect of this card happens, I have the chance to respond and do something if I'd like. And I do have something that I'd like to respond with, so I'm going to pay 4 mana of my own by tapping all 4 of my forests. And I'm going to play my own instant card in response to this Vicious Offering. I'm going to play Gift of Growth. Something I should point out about these cards, though, is that the reason that both me and my opponent are able to play these during the combat phase is because these are specifically instants. Normally, we cannot play cards like creatures or artifacts or enchantments, or even these other cards, sorceries, at any time except during one of our own main phases. Instants are kind of special though, because you can play them at what's called instant speed. And one way you could think of instant cards is that it's basically the same thing as a sorcery, except that you can play this at any point in the game, rather than like a sorcery, which can only be on one of your main phases. So you'll see this card costs 1 and a green, so 2 mana. However, I've paid 4 mana for it. That's because this one also has this kicker ability, and I'm going to pay the cost for the kicker ability. So it says kicker 2. That means that I can pay an additional 2 mana as I cast this spell in order to get the kicker ability. What it says is untap target creature. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn instead. So I've responded to Vicious Offering by targeting my Terrain Elemental with Gift of Growth, and I've paid the kicker cost. So now I've added this card to the stack, and you can see that there's kind of a visual representation of an actual stack of cards now. My opponent would then have a chance to respond to this card before the effect resolves. However, they only have 1 mana available, and in their hand they don't have any spells that they can cast, so we're going to resolve the stack now. So the order in which these cards' effects will happen is that the last one which was cast will be the first one to resolve, and then we work down the stack until all of them have resolved. So first this one will resolve, and my creature will get +4/+4 until end of turn. So Gift of Growth goes to the graveyard, because it's not a permanent, and now my Terrain Elemental is no longer a 3/2, it's actually a 7/6. Something worth noting is this bonus to power and toughness is different from adding a counter, like was mentioned earlier with this card. This bonus will only be in effect until the end of the turn, and then this creature will go back to its base power and toughness. However, if this had added counters, rather than just giving it a bonus to power and toughness, the counters would stay on the creature until something removes them or until the creature dies, or gets moved to a different zone, such as maybe to my hand, or maybe put back into my deck even. So after this Gift of Growth has resolved, we're going to continue moving down the stack until all of these cards have resolved. Next is the Vicious Offering. This will then give my creature -2/-2 until end of turn. So this resolves and goes to the graveyard. Now my Terrain Elemental is no longer a 7/6, it's actually a 5/4. So I'd ask my opponent again, can we go to the damage step? And at this point, there's nothing that they can do, so they would say yes, and we will go to the damage step. And the reason that I'm asking the opponent that is because any time that you move to a different phase in a turn, or any time, say, a card is cast or something like that, a player gets what's called priority. And throughout the game, priority is constantly shifting between each player, and it just means that that player has the opportunity to play something if they would like, and the player must pass priority to the opponent before the game can proceed. This is often shortcutted though, just to speed the game up. Typically there is an understanding between the players for when someone might want to take priority to cast a spell, but if you do have priority at any point and you would like the opportunity to do something, you can just stop your opponent and say that you would like to take action, maybe cast a spell or spend some mana or something like that. So both the opponent and I agree that we can go to the damage step, so damage will be dealt. So now that this creature has 5 power, it's going to do 5 damage to the opponent. So it'll go from 20 to 15 life. So after combat, it would go to my main phase 2, and there's nothing I can do, so it would pass to the opponent. And the game would basically continue on for several more turns until either one player's life reaches 0, or a player runs out of cards in their library and they have no cards left to draw. So I feel like at this point we've covered pretty much what you would need to know in order to have the basic knowledge required to start playing a game of Magic the Gathering. As I mentioned earlier, this video by no means covers all of the rules. The game can tend to get somewhat complicated at times, and it's also, an ever-evolving game. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Let me know what you thought of this video, and if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. Otherwise though, thanks for watching. I'd like to take a moment to thank all the patrons who support me on Patreon. You can find a link to that in the video description below, as well as a link to my Discord server, where everyone's welcome to join if you'd like to come and talk about Magic or anything related to gaming in that matter. And there you'll also find an affiliate link for Dragon Shield, which is a supporter of the channel, So if you're looking to buy any gaming supplies, such as maybe some sleeves or a deck box to go with your cards, you can follow that affiliate link and support the channel while also getting some great supplies from Dragon Shield. But thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.